This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, graduate students, and everyone in between, culture workers, and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Derek Handley, who teaches in the Department of English at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Along with a number of articles on rhetoric, urban studies, and composition, he is the author of Struggle for the City, Rhetorics of Citizenship and Resistance During the Black Freedom Movement, from 2024. In this conversation, we discuss the place of rhetorical work in the Black intellectual tradition, community work in politics, and the future of Black studies as a multidisciplinary project. Good afternoon, Derek. How are you today?
I'm doing well, John. Thanks for having me here. I'm so excited to be added to the long line of Black studies scholars, activists, artists that have been on this podcast. So I'm very excited about this opportunity.
Well, I'm so happy that we made this time. You know, you and I have known each other for a while, and I was really excited to get your voice on the podcast for a lot of reasons. I think the kind of work you're doing is super interesting. I'm the host of this podcast, but I know that my co-host Ashley is going to be really excited about this. She also has training in rhetoric like you, and sort of language and Black studies is really the centerpiece of so much of what she does. So I just think that's an incredibly important perspective to have on this. And we are recording this on the last day of the fall semester for me. So this is a nice goodbye to this is called a challenging time in our nation's and campus's history.
Absolutely.
And so long way of saying, welcome to the Black Studies Podcast, and really look forward to this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you.
So we'll have a chance to, of course, talk about your work and how you think about the field of Black studies and the relationship between all of that. But we always start off with this more personal question. I want to hear you talk a little bit about what drew you to the study of Black life, what got you interested in Black studies, and always for me the really important question that comes with that, which is what keeps you committed to and sustains you in relation to this kind of work.
Well, thanks for that question. You know, I've been thinking about this journey, this origin story, as I shared with you prior to us starting that I've been listening to this podcast a lot and thinking about this question. And I think the source for me really was in high school. Now, my parents are both part of the Great Migration. I was born to older parents, and then in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My father was from Alabama. My mother was from North Carolina, and they came to Pittsburgh. But they were part of that first generation to buy houses in suburbs. And so I grew up in a suburb of Pittsburgh, but it's definitely working class. But the high school and the schools were still predominantly nearly all white teachers in this white perspective. And, you know, I was, of course, a consumer of hip hop and whatever pop cultural references and things like that. And I remember in high school, you know, because in high school, you pretty much taught about slavery, the ending of the slaves, and then it goes dark, and then next thing you know, it's the civil rights movement. That was pretty much the extent. And I think one of the earlier guests had used the phrase curricular violence. And I sort of felt the same way.
Yeah, it stuck with me too. Yeah, I remember that.
Curricular violence. And so I don't know how I came across an image of the Black Panthers in Oakland, California, Huey Newton or something like that. And I remember going to my social studies teacher, who was an older lady. She's probably the generation before the baby boomers. I mean, she was old then. And we're talking about in the 80s here. And I asked her about, you know, what does she know about the Black Panthers? And she said something to the fact, oh, they were just a bunch of thugs. And I'm like, I was taken aback because, you know, here I am a teenager growing into a young man, and I'm seeing these images of pride and self-respect, the black leather
Mhm.
and the black berets and stuff. And so that necessarily wasn't um reconciling with me. Her
Mhm.
characterizations of them. And so I set out to start trying to find out a little bit more about myself. So Black Studies in the very beginning was initially a very independent scholarship. Um, but it wasn't something I was thinking of trying to, do in school. I was all focused on being a naval aviator. The movie Top Gun came out, and I'd already been thinking about naval aviation, and I
Amazing.
was I was going into the Navy, and unfortunately, I wasn't. I was too much of a lazy student in high school. I joined the Navy right out of high school. But while I was in the Navy, while I was in the Navy, I was able to apply and get accepted to a naval ROTC scholarship, and this was at the height of Different World and the Cosby Show and black colleges and
Mhm.
conscious hip hop and stuff like that. And being in the Navy, being around different black people from across the nation and things like that. And so I ended up going to Hampton University on a ROTC scholarship. I started out as a computer science major because if it's the 80s was about these, respectable type jobs, if you will, doctors and
Mhm.
lawyers and being the professional class. But I quickly found out my first semester that computer science was not it. I was, I was in the wrong place.
It
Somebody
is a
told
very
me
specific
wrong.
kind of skill set. It's a very specific skill
Yes.
set, yeah.
But I loved reading. I loved writing. If I wasn't going to be a naval aviator, the second job was a sports writer. And I was already writing for the Hampton Script, which was the school newspaper. And so it came down to changing between English or journalism, and I chose English. And that is what really expanded. Majoring in English at Hampton University was more like majoring in African American literature. And I recall Gwendolyn Brooks visiting Hampton during my time there. And I remember thinking, how come I never had heard of her? Right. So being able to read Toni Morrison and Alice Walker, discovering W.B. Du Bois and James Baldwin and all Ralph Ellison. I was really big on Ralph Ellison, and then Carter G. Woodson, The Miseducation of the Negro. It was just like this expansion, this expansion of ideas and explosion, if you will, going on in my head. So it was a wonderful experience. And then to do my undergraduate thesis on reading all of Toni Morrison's books that was published at that time, which was very difficult. I remember the first Toni Morrison book I picked up was Jazz. And oh my goodness, she is such a brilliant writer, and the depth and the layers. And I tell my students now, I said, look, you got to find a quiet place. You don't
Yeah.
have any other distractions because you have to work. But once you get
Mhm.
in Morrison's worldview and understanding, it's a little bit better. So that was it for me. And what's driving me is this constant learning. Now I graduated from Hampton. Now I'm going into the Navy. So I'm sort of away from academia. And I like to joke with people when folks ask, well, what can you do with an English degree? And I say, well, you can go fly Navy helicopters, because that's what I did for a few years
Mhm.
in the Navy. But the whole time I was in the Navy, I was still reading on my own. And the 60s Black Power movement is what had captured my interest. And I'm reading Eldridge Cleaver. I'm reading Stokely Carmichael, the Soledad brothers, things regarding Angela Davis. I was always reading something, but I still wasn't thinking of it as something that I wanted to write about or research about. And when my time was coming out from so I did 10 years. And so when I was getting out the Navy, I was coming back home to Pittsburgh. I wanted to teach. My goal was to get a job at a community college. I learned I could get a job, just with a master's degree at a community college. So I initially pursued a MFA in creative writing at the University of Pittsburgh. And Pittsburgh schools was pretty much the only schools I was looking at because it was home, and I was coming back home to help my sister take care of my mom, who had a stroke. But during that time, during the MFA, I realized the things that I was thinking about in terms of literature, Baldwin and things of that sort, was something different that they were doing in creative writing. I didn't know the contemporary writers. As well as when I first started, I think I was the only Black person in the program. And there weren't any, at least on the fiction side, anybody Black who was teaching there. I mean, I had a great experience, wonderful colleagues, but I realized that this probably wasn't the area for me. But it was only until I took a course in rhetorical education, taught by your now colleague, Jessica Enoch. And
oh, really? I had no idea.
Yes.
Small world. Wow. Okay.
Yes, Jessica
She's
Enoch.
just right down the hall. I'm sitting here.
Right down the hall. And I'm gonna put this out there. She gets a kick out of it. I always refer to her as my rhetoric mama because she brought me into the world of rhetoric. And
it's a
she
great
was
title
there.
to have, actually.
And Scott was down at West Virginia, commuting, University of West Virginia, and kind of like how I was at Hampton, it was just opening these ideas to African American rhetoric and activist rhetorics. And I said, I want to know more about this. I want to know more about this. I want to learn more about this. And that's when I first started thinking about PhD programs in rhetoric. Up to that time, like I said, I was just a consumer of Black studies, any of the public intellectuals I'd see on TV, when I was in the Navy, I would watch. I remember reading Cornel West's Race Matters when I was in the Navy, and I had his book in one hand and a dictionary in the other hand because he was using these words I didn't understand.
Man,
but the scholarly pursuit.
If we could get students to read with a dictionary, the world would yes. That's so old school, but it should not be so old school.
Old school. It is so
Sorry to interrupt you, but I just had a moment.
No, that's
you
fine.
You said reading with a dictionary.
Yeah. And I'll just wrap this point up. It was when I was looking at programs, staying in Western Pennsylvania, there was Penn State, Pitt, and Carnegie Mellon. Went out to visit Penn State, and I had an hour-long conversation with Keith Gilliard, who I would love to see on this podcast at some point. And in that hour conversation with him about African-American rhetoric, and just Black studies in general, was so enlightening. It was such a wonderful, and it was, I still reference that conversation. And he was one of the first persons to help me to think more about James Baldwin, and just from the short stories that I may have read in an exemplar, if you will. So I knew that this is what I wanted to do. Now, the hard part of this was I'm a non-traditional graduate student. By this time in my mid-30s. I have bills. I have a son. So I had to get a job, and I was able to get a job at a community college. And Carnegie Mellon was the only school that was going to let me do graduate school part-time. So I'm teaching Monday and Wednesday and Friday at the community college, and I'm taking graduate courses at at Carnegie Mellon in rhetoric. But while there, I get to meet Joe Trotter, who is the premier urban historian who wrote a book called Black Milwaukee. And so it was important for me, even though that there wasn't anyone at CMU in African-American rhetoric, there was this historian, Black historian, that I want to make sure that I was taking classes with him. So even from the very beginning, it was interdisciplinary. So I'm going to stop right there because I know I can probably get long-winded. So I'm going to let you jump back in.
I love that. Thank you. That's a incredibly interesting and important, set of stories. I mean, I was totally interested. I was like, oh, that's right. We have to go on with the podcast because that journey has so many interesting dimensions to it that I think are in their own way, just the story of Black studies, of this like being told one thing about the world, these pictures of Black Panthers and saying like, I don't think that makes sense to me, and that
doesn't make
birth
sense
to a field of study,
right?
Rather than just, well, it's not just, but rather than simply an objection, it becomes a whole different kind of life. I do want to note too, the Jessica Enoch thing is really funny. I had no idea; it totally caught me by surprise. But also, I think you are the second Navy vet on
third.
Podcast. Also. So there's Michael Sawyer, who's also at Pitt. So that was
Michael Sawyer. So after hearing him on this podcast, I reached out to him when I came home to visit, and had coffee with him. And I think Austin Jackson was the second.
Right. Yes.
Second Navy. Is he at Brown?
He's
I
at
believe. Brown.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah, I was like, wow, I'm thinking my journey is unique, and up until this podcast. So it's similar. And I think you've had a couple of Hamptonians as well.
Yeah. I think 2 or 3 other Hampton grads.
Yes.
Yeah. So
yeah.
I think my youngest kid wants to go there. So
oh, good.
Wants to solve the dispute about who's the real HU. So
choose
that
is
against
so
his local university.
That is so funny. That is so funny.
Oh, at 14, he's already picking fights. I like it. So let me ask you a question about Black studies in particular, and how you imagine, or what the field, or what's that portrait of Black studies that you work with. And I always like to ask this in the context of its origin, which I think still sits with us in a tense kind of way, which is origin of Black studies is on the one hand the demand by students, some faculty, but mostly undergraduate students, that there be a place on campuses to study Black life, to study the Black intellectual tradition, to cultivate it, to grow it as scholars and students. And that's really given birth to this dominant strain in Black studies of the study of the intellectual tradition and writerly thinking life. But of course, this happens, the founding of Black studies, at a time where the Black liberation struggles, radicalization has really blurred the boundaries between something like study and activism, between the classroom and the community, between ideas and prescriptive political action. And that's given birth to this other really powerful part of the Black studies tradition, which is the demand for a certain kind of politics, a certain kind of relation to community, and a certain kind of prescription. And so I think that tension that's at the heart of the founding of the field is also a tension with us today in 2025.
Yes.
Yes. And so I'm interested in sort of in that context, how you think about the field. What's that portrait you work with and how it orients you?
How I think about the field, and I've been thinking a lot about it historically lately. I lost my mom a few years ago, and going through, her archives, and I think I mentioned she was an immigrant to Pittsburgh from North Carolina, high school education, but she was very active in NAACP and things of this sort. But going through her files, I see this binder, Inside Black Studies, from the University of Pittsburgh. It's like 1969. And it's sort of like a course catalog. And what I found very interesting is how everybody had the same honorific brother so-and-so, sister so-and-so. It didn't matter if you had a PhD, didn't matter if you had an MA, if you're administrator of staff. Brother Rob Penny, who was a poet and contemporary of August Wilson. And so visually, I'm seeing this intellectual and all the courses that they're teaching. They were teaching Yoruba. They were teaching Francophone African, teaching French language with some West African, maybe with Senegalese grammatical structures. So, but they're establishing community in the ways that they're writing, as well as providing this intellectual basis, if you will. So, I think the strength of Black studies is this close connection to the community, to the Black community in these places where there is, institutions where there is a critical mass of Black people. And I think those departments or those programs, not everybody can do the community work. Not everybody's equipped for that. But for someone, perhaps have some sort of closer attachment to it. I think one of the things that's difficult, when you're going on a job search, you might be, I get a job here in Milwaukee, but I'm not from Milwaukee. So I don't have the nuances, understandings of the community, and that develops over a period of time. But what makes the African and African Diaspora Studies department here is that they have people teaching in the department who have close connections to Milwaukee, who has the ethos of being a Milwaukee resident. So I think those things are important, both the intellectual side, what we produce in our scholarship in general about Black studies, but also the connection and being accessible to the local community.
Yeah, thank you for that. No, I really appreciate that, and I think thinking in nuanced ways as well as sort of politically imperative or morally imperative ways about relationships to community is so important. And it's come up on a couple of different podcasts, more sort of on the edges of people's comments, but I think is this question that sort of sits with me about how to think about Black studies in relation to community in two senses. One is, what about teaching Black studies in places where there aren't Black people, right? In significant numbers. But also, as you're pointing out, which I think it's a really complex question. I think we should have a separate podcast episode. We're keep meaning to develop some topical episodes. But this question of what it means to do community work in a community that hasn't been yours, but that you want to be, as you're talking about. I just think that's such a compelling and interesting and complicated question it's not just a question of strategy or technique or communication. It's also a question of deepest values and what political solidarity looks like, and the way regions are different. Milwaukee is different than Pittsburgh. Right.
I mean, there's some similarities, but regions are different. When I was teaching at the community college, my mentor, Dr. Ralph Proctor, who we lost a couple years ago, he was an example of the community scholar / activist. He was from Pittsburgh, did his PhD in history at the University of Pittsburgh. Any type of protests, he was there on the forefront. So I think it's important for those departments to have somebody local like that.
Yeah, no,
but it's easier said than done, I guess.
It is, because, as you know, hiring is it's its own drama. Well, I still have some scars. I'm going to just go ahead and not talk anymore about that. Well, let me ask you a little bit about your work in relation to Black studies. Your work is, we'll have a link to your book, and so maybe it's the time when you say a few words about it. But the little narrative that comes with this, make sure it's a link to the book. Your work is invested in cultural history and literary studies and rhetoric, as you've talked about. And I just think there's so many insights to be generated from this kind of confluence of interests that you have. And so I'm interested in, as you think about your own work in relation to Black studies, how you think it fits in the tradition of the field, but also what, if any, boundaries you think it pushes or new horizons it opens up.
That's an excellent question, and I've been giving some thought to it. When I first began this project, so I look at the ways in which 3 Black communities responded to urban renewal in the 50s and 60s, and Pittsburgh, my hometown, Milwaukee, and St. Paul, Minnesota. And what I found, or one of the things I found interesting, is the ways in which the civil rights movement is talked about and the way in which the Black Power movement is talked about. And I was thinking about this with some of those Black history courses I was taking at Carnegie Mellon. And the pattern often seems, at least in my field, let me talk about rhetoric. I don't want to upset any historians. But in my field, it seemed like when we're talking about the civil rights movement and those figures, we're always talking in the Southern context.
Yeah.
Even in high school, it's funny, when I was teaching in Pittsburgh and here in Milwaukee, they could tell me more about the local histories of Montgomery, Alabama and Selma, Alabama than they can in their own city. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to explore that. In urban renewal, when it was occurring, when it was happening, first beginning in 1954, 1955, 1966, this is overlapping with the Montgomery bus boycott. So the civil rights movement in these northern cities were centered around folks about to lose their houses. And it didn't matter if you were more Martin Luther King or more Malcolm X, your house was still going to get torn down. So folks had to get to work together and to organize together. So I was thinking about that story. The original thought was like, oh, maybe it'll change over time. But, as we tell graduate students, you got to think about scope and stuff. I'm already doing 3 different cities, which could be 3 books in of itself. But I wanted to see what the communities were doing. So it's a book about these communities. So the other part of the civil rights movement, we know the big names. We know the Dr. Martin Luther King. To a lesser extent, I don't want to group Malcolm X in there with the civil rights movement, but he definitely played a part. Stokely Carmichael. But who are the Fannie Lou Hamers in Pittsburgh? Who are the Fannie Lou Hamers in Milwaukee? Who are the Fannie Lou Hamers in St. Paul? Who are the people that we don't necessarily know about? And I didn't want it to be just if I just focus on Pittsburgh, it'd be more of a local. But to compare these 3 cities, what were they doing? Seeing these organizations that popped up in response to urban renewal, and the lessons learned. And even though they weren't able to completely save their neighborhoods, they were able to modify in certain ways and get some small victories and lessons learned. So that's what the book was trying to do. And it was trying to answer, use whatever resource, even though I'm trained as a rhetorician, urban history had something, geography and Black geographies had something. The central question was, what did Black people do when they first heard about urban renewal? We already know the top-down story. We already know the aftermath. I wanted to know when they first heard and what those conversations were.
I love that's a great summary. That's a great pitch for the book, by the way. I mean, you hear that? No, I mean, just that question, like who's your local Fannie Lou Hamer? I might use that phrase actually when students, because I find a lot of undergrads, and sometimes it can come off as they just kind of want to study themselves, but
Mhm.
it has. I always think it gets massaged into such more interesting things. If you work with them as their teacher, but they will want to know like more about their local community, like here,
Right.
in Prince George's County, in D.C.,
Right.
maybe Montgomery or Howard County, or Charles County, but it's usually PG County. And getting them, that's like getting them to ask a bigger question. I love that. Like that, I mean, that's your research question for a book, but I just think it's like one of those things for every book that every question in a book is also a question for an 18-year-old, is a question for a 90-year-old, to
Right.
orient around this really imperative question, which is we have to stop thinking about there's a finite number of big,
Mhm.
important leaders, right? Every community,
Right.
as you said, had their version of that, and what it means to do community histories in that way. I love that. Yeah. That's a long way of saying I'm really moved by your description of that project. So
Thank you. I appreciate that.
it's sort of, I think, like sort of following on that or sort of expanding that. I'm interested, your graduate work was, you described, you did creative writing,
Mhm.
rhetoric and literary studies, English. And so you did disciplinary doctoral training. Uh,
Yes.
but you're also now working in and clearly identifying your research in the African American and African diasporic studies, Black studies tradition. And
Mhm.
so I'm interested in how that sort of movement between disciplinary training and your professional work and professional classrooms and affiliations being in multidisciplinary or area studies, how you think that movement between discipline and non-discipline has informed how you approach a research project, but also maybe how it has informed how you construct a classroom, how you make a class work.
Yes. So, yeah, I was definitely trained in methods. Carnegie Mellon was real big on, research methods and rhetoric.
Mm.
Uh, but part of that training was being able to do, um, when I was getting ready for exams, doing a deep dive in what is African American rhetoric. So, I remember when I'm doing this research and this history on African American rhetoric, um, I I I kept seeing um, this one name over and over again, and I'm like, wait a second, who is this person, and why am I not seeing what they're doing now? Well, the person who was real big in talking about Black rhetoric and revolutionary rhetoric, he later changed his name to Molefi Asante
Mm,
and
mhm.
started his own Black studies. So, um, and so through studying African American rhetoric was kind of leading to me to these different ideas of Black studies. What does this mean to be doing Black studies? Um, and I wanted to be more part of that tradition. And that was part of my, like, okay, let me think about this as a discipline. Let me think about this. I remember attending a conference at the NCBS, National Council of Black Studies, saw and kind of seeing what this is that folks are doing, how are they conceptualizing. And I've arrived at the idea that um, you know, there's this question of methods, and I tend to believe that some of the Black rhetoric methodology that I was trying to do in my book sort of speaks to that. And the example is I talk about Black organizing as sort of like call and response, right? The leaders put out the call, but the message only works if the audience respond, and how they respond. So that's sort of how I was theorizing a little bit in the book. So that's how I see my research and thinking about that. I think African American rhetoric was there from the very beginning in terms of Black Studies departments. But in terms of teaching, and this is what I enjoy, and you talk about places where that there is no Black Studies departments or programs. While I was a graduate student, while I was dissertating, I was in the reserves, Navy Reserves, and I came back on active duty to teach at the United States Naval Academy, which was a wonderful and awesome experience for me, both as a Navy person and an academic. Now I'm dissertating, so I'm still a graduate student, but here I am, I'm teaching at a 4-year institution. And the way it works at the Naval Academy, half the faculty are civilian PhDs and other half are military, where all you need was just an MA. So it was important to me to bring what I would call micro Black studies to some of the courses I was teaching. Mm-hmm. Whether it's just their first year writing course was called Rhetoric and Intro to Literature, which is a very interesting combination. And I would use Baldwin, who did both. He made arguments and he would use essays. I think the highlight, there's 2 courses I was able to teach at the Naval Academy, and I use courses as a way to learn myself. So I taught an African literature course, which I really got deep into, negritude and a debate with Achebe, and I forget the other scholar's name, as to whether you should write in English or, write in the language of the colonizer or the language of your people. So exploring these ideas there. But the highlight was teaching a course on August Wilson. And it was the first and only course, and I imagine for some of the students, where I had a majority Black students in the class at the United States Naval Academy. And we was exploring August Wilson through his love of the blues. So we're playing music. It was too ambitious, John, trying to do all 10 plays in a semester.
That is a lot, actually. That's wild.
I think we read 9 and we watched one. There was only one that had been turned into a film. I think it was Piano Lesson with Charles Dutton. But it was way too ambitious. But you can talk about the different dynamics of Black life in the different decades, as well as Black history. But it was important for me to bring Black studies into those spaces, because when those young men and women, and at that time when I was there, when transgendered, go out into get their commission, they're not going to be stationed in Madison, Wisconsin. They're not going to be stationed in Des Moines, Iowa. They're a global organization. So it's important for them to be able to think outside of the way that they were raised, Black, white, or whatever. So I thought it was important for them to get exposure to some Black studies perspective, because the other part of it, 40%, actually might be closer to 50% of the enlisted people in the military are Black and brown. Mm-hmm. So they're going to be in charge of Black people. So it's important that you have a little bit of an understanding of Black ways of knowing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. That's totally fascinating. I love those moments of enthusiasm too, just like sort of laughing at the reading, trying to read 10 plays and,
Yes.
those moments of ambition where you're just like, wow, what have we gotten ourselves into? It's a great problem to have, but it is,
yes,
it's a problem to have.
I was so naive but it was a great class. It was a wonderful class. And the other thing about that class, and this is a little bit off topic, but that was when I came into class, one of my students said, "Sir, I think you need to sit down." I said, "Why? What's going on?" He said, "Prince just died." And that's when I first learned that Prince had passed away, and I'm a huge Prince fan. So,
oh wow. I remember myself. I was driving to Ithaca, New York for a conference, and you couldn't find a radio station that wasn't playing Prince all day. It was amazing.
Man, it was
even in upstate New York.
Sharp. Wow. Yeah.
Well, let me ask you this next to last question, one of the last two questions I want to ask you, and specifically thinking about the history and future of the field of Black studies. What do you think that Black studies as a field has done well, and what do you think it has not done particularly well?
There's a couple of things. I think Black studies. Well, let me answer this question from my own personal perspective. I think Black studies, what has done well is what I want to say, liberation of individuals, decolonizing the mind, if you will, through its public scholarship, right? Again, I didn't grow up in academia, but there were so many different things available. And this is, students don't even remember pre-internet. I remember being at Hampton and getting these, Malcolm X tapes and being able to listen to his speeches, Black bookstores being available. And so, growing up in a integrated neighborhood, but not really seeing yourself pictured in the school curriculum and stuff, you have a certain view of yourself. And so just by Black studies existing, first at HBCUs and of course at PWIs, in the products that they were producing was liberating. Another liberation, just to go back a little bit, was when I first came to Amherst on fellowship and looking at the syllabus for that intro Black Studies course. And matter of fact, I think it's still online, that Jeff Ferguson, your colleague, produced.
Jeff and I designed that, and critical debates in Black studies. He and I put those together years ago. So rest in peace, indeed. Glad to hear his name on the podcast.
I saw that syllabus. I'm like, this is what I do. This is what I mean, the argument and the Tolman method. And this is the stuff that we were talking about in graduate school. And that was liberating, and seeing Black studies in that particular way. So I think the public scholarship and public intellectuals, I know we have a love-hate with public intellectuals, but people who are not in the academy, which for a big chunk of my adult life I was not, it was a way for me to consume some of these ideas. I don't know if you remember when Tavis Smiley used to have that State of the Union or something like that, and I set it on record, and it was very performative, some of the guests that was on there and things like that. But it was, I mean, I learned a lot. I definitely, Michael Eric Dyson on there and some of these quote unquote celebrity Black intellectuals. So I think that's what it's done well. Now, what could it do? I think because I don't have a degree in Black Studies and I'm just affiliated with a Black Studies type department, I'm a little bit hesitant to say, well,
everybody's pretty hesitant on this question.
This is what y'all need to do better.
I always say, traditions only develop because of disputes and things that were left not done that get done. So, yeah.
I think you all touched on this a little bit, and this is something that's been going on in some Black rhetoric circles. The relationship, between American Black people and Black people from the continent. I think there's a not knowing of each other and having ideas in these places of ignorance. And, a lot of things that I had been thinking about or been taught about in terms of Africa often refers to pre-colonial Africa, right? Egypt and Egyptology and things of that sort. And then we'll jump ahead to, maybe Ghana getting its independence in 1957 or the Mandela in South Africa. But there's a hole in my knowledge, and it might be out there, which I will explore, is like what was going on in West Africa during colonization. Who were some of the other folks who maybe might not be very well known? Those are some of the questions I have. Over 1 million West African soldiers fought in World War II.
Mm-hmm.
So they're fighting for global freedom. What was like for them when they came back home? And were they part of the undercurrents? So those are some of the questions about Africa. You did have one scholar who was on here, and unfortunately I forgot his name, and he talked about when he went to his PhD in African history, how he was the only African American in the program. So I think those are some of those conversations I think I would like to see a little bit more of, and I imagine there's going to be a scholar or two might be listening to this who emailed me saying, I wrote about this. So
good.
I hope that's the case.
I always love it when that happens, because I'm always like, I have not seen everything. So please give me that book I've been saying I wish was written.
Right.
But I love that. I think that's such an important imperative. And the place of Africa generally in Black studies has come up in these podcasts repeatedly. And I think this way of thinking about it, which connects to, as you said, the sort of moral and political imperatives of your own work in African American studies, of thinking about, who are the people, and how are things received in these particular moments, rather than just simply the sort of Leopold Senghors or Frantz Fanons of these revolutionary moments. I love that. And maybe that's actually partly an answer to the last question that I have for you, which is, what is the one question or the one issue that you would want us to be thinking about or asking in Black studies?
First, let me say that there is a lot of questions. And this podcast, with all your guests have been answering this question differently. I will add that what I love about this podcast is probably the same thing I hate about it. What I love about it is all these suggestions of books. And so my reading list has become longer and longer and longer.
At a certain point, you need another couple of lives. So yes.
That's what I'm saying. That causes me anxiety. It's like knowing that I may die and I haven't read everything on my reading list. But I'm going to answer it a little differently. And John, I'm going to put you and Ashley on the hook for this for a little bit.
All right.
We are in some crazy times right now. And everybody know that. And I think about what you all have said. If the department goes away, who's going to stand up in support of us? And we're seeing this in other areas. We're seeing the starvation of resources and funds. What I would love to see happen in my current research now, I'm in the 19th century. I'm looking at these colored conventions project. Penn State has digitized these Black people organizing in the 19th century, and having these conventions. I would love to see something like that. I would love to see the heads of the families, to use a Godfather reference, or I would like to see all the directors, the chair, the department chairs of these different programs. I would love to see you all get together at some location. I'm going to volunteer Northwestern because it's down the street from me, and in the center part of the country, and not for no presentations of those papers, but to ask the question is, what now? Where do we go from here? If you can't find solidarity within your own university, can you find solidarity with each other? I know some people may have different ideologies of what Black studies is, Africana studies, Africology, Black studies. I would love to see that. I would love to see that. And I don't know what comes out of it or what you could produce. Maybe there's regional conferences, but maybe you can share ideas and share what you've learned here in this context and what can help someone else out there. Finding solidarity with each other, because right now it feels like we're all in our own individual silos fighting certain battles, and maybe it just be a help from another chair or someone who's writing a letter to the institution to say, hey, this is why this department is important.
Look, this is such a fantastic place to wrap this up. Thank you so much for that. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I think something like that has to come together. I mentioned this on a couple of podcasts, I think during recording, certainly before recording, and have said to many people in person, the Indiana program got shut down and there was no sense of a place to look for the quote unquote Black studies response.
Right.
And that's raises this question that you've sketched out a really important response, not necessarily an answer, but a really important response to is like, well, maybe we haven't sat in the room together. As you said, the heads of the families. I love that.
Right.
Recently watched The Godfather. I'm like, this film's like still really good. But I love that idea for a lot of reasons. I think it'd be really interesting. I think so many people would absolutely love it and learn so much. But as you said, when you started it, it's like, it's not just because we would learn so much. It's because the stakes are everything and we need to start acting like the stakes are everything right now. And I really love that. Thank you for bringing us to that point. Yeah. And thank you so much for this conversation. I mean, I was really looking forward to it. And this has just been so fantastic. I can't wait for it to be a part of the series. I'm so glad you made time. And I'm so glad you listen. And like me, feel like you're learning enough for another couple of lifetimes of reading and thought. But I think, you brought real gravity to the questions of your own research, to the stakes of our writing and thinking, and here at the end to the question of, are we rising to our political moment? This is really important stuff, Derek. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. Like I said, long-time listener, first-time caller. So I really enjoyed this and being added to the Black Studies podcast archive. I mean, this is a career moment for myself, so I really appreciate it. Thank you.
It is absolutely our privilege. So, well, we are on the holiday season, so have a great holiday and end of the calendar year, and this will be coming out in the new year, and it'll be a really fantastic, galvanizing perspective for people to be listening to as their semesters start back up. So,
thank you. Happy holidays to you. You too.
Right,
take care.
All right. Bye.